Hello, everybody. It is Thursday, November the 13th, 2025. Back in August, we did a show about the reappearance of what one guest described as the military-industrial digital complex, the new military-industrial digital complex. We called the show Dr. Strangelove Returns. It was an interview with Ben Freeman, the director of the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Ben is the co-author of a book, The $1 Trillion War Machine, which is out this week. It was out on Tuesday. And its co-author is my guest today, William Hartung, who is a researcher, senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute. And I'm thrilled that Bill is joining us from Washington, D.C. Bill, congratulations on the new book. You've done a lot of research for it, The $1 Trillion War Machine. We talk in trillions these days about AI in particular. We're talking about NVIDIA as a $5 trillion company. Is $1 trillion a lot of money for America to be spending on its military defense budget?
Yes, I think if you compare it to other things that are being starved, I mean, the F-35, which is kind of a dodgy plane, gets more money every year than the Centers for Disease Control or the Environmental Protection Agency. So, if we were raising revenue instead of cutting taxes, perhaps this would work. But we're cutting taxes, we're eliminating the Agency for International Development, we're scaling back on things like nutrition programs, public health. So it's the trade-off, I think, that is the problem. The Pentagon budget's been untouched in all these cuts. In fact, is dramatically increasing. So
we can't use the same title for this conversation as with the one with your co-author Ben Freeman. But are we talking about the return of Dr. Strangelove? Is there a new military-industrial digital complex, or is it really just the old one digitalized?
It remains to be seen, but there's certainly a battle in the short term. Anduril, which is run by the aging gamer Palmer Luckey, they have a little manifesto, the rebooting the arsenal of democracy, and it's a pretty good critique of the old guard, the Lockheed Martins and so forth. They're more interested in getting contracts and making money than making weapons that defend the country. They're kind of tied into pork barrel politics. So it almost sounds like they're these rebels. And they're saying, well, we'll do it cheaper. We're more nimble. We can build the weapons of the future. But it doesn't stop there. Next thing you know, they're telling us practically that they're a superior form of human beings, and we should just step back and let them run things. And then, of course, Peter Thiel thinks he can come up with a way to live forever. And Musk wants to colonize space on a large scale. So it's, to me, the problem is, all right, you've got this technology, prove to me that it works for some useful purpose, and then you can sell it to us. But you shouldn't be able to shape our foreign policy and kind of act like you're kind of these new technological gods, because that is just not the case. And the more influence they have, in some ways, the more dangerous it is, because unlike the old guard, or at least somewhat circumspect, Palmer Luckey's talking about we're going to win a war with China. It's just a whole different kettle of fish. The president of Palantir has a book called The Technological Republic.
Yeah, I'm interested that you bring up Palantir. Alex Karp has been in the news a great deal. There was a recent piece this week by Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times on how Karp went from a Biden donor to a Trump enabler. Karp fancies himself as an intellectual, but he's certainly now more and more in the Trump camp. Of course, Palantir was founded or co-founded by Peter Thiel. Is Palantir a classic example of this new kind of Silicon Valley company that is exploiting the generosity of government and the slowness of government to profit itself?
Yeah, I think of Thiel as kind of the godfather of this resurgence of militarism in Silicon Valley. Of course, their initial funding and research came from the Pentagon, but there was a point where they decided they could make as much money in the commercial market. They didn't like all the paperwork. They drifted a bit from working directly for DoD. Then the Pentagon courted them, brought them back. But Thiel got a big contract from In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital arm, after 9/11, because one of the issues was they had more intel than they could process. And he promised that his systems could do that for them. So he was already doing this, more than 20 years ago. But he recruited Palmer Luckey into the business, gave him initial funding. Of course, J.D. Vance worked for him. He funded Vance's Senate campaign. So he's kind of like a central player in all of this. And he's also, to my mind, somewhat unhinged between this "we can live forever" argument.
This is Thiel rather than Karp.
Yeah, Karp himself kind of seemed postured as more like a normal person. I mean, he funded Biden.
Anyone seems probably normal compared to Thiel.
Yes.
Last year, one of the Financial Times books of the year on its shortlist was one by Raj Shah and Christopher Kirchhoff. They were on the show. It's called Unit X: How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley Are Transforming the Future of War. It's not quite as pessimistic or as bleak as your book, although it's not necessarily just an embrace of Silicon Valley. But is there an argument to be made, Bill, that Silicon Valley can make the Pentagon more efficient, quicker? I mean, it's defined by its slowness, by its inefficiencies, perhaps its corruptness. So I'm not sure if you've read the Shah-Kirchhoff book, but is it important? Can Silicon Valley or should Silicon Valley be responsible for making the Pentagon more efficient, quicker, faster?
Well, I think they have some capability to do that. And, you need power to break up this oligopoly of the big five contractors. So in that sense, they can do that. I think they certainly are quicker. I think they make claims for their technology that are not proven, probably exaggerated. I think the ideal world is they push that notion, but there's still got to be some guardrails. Like their idea is get rid of all this regulation, but some of the regulations they want to get rid of are like independent testing to make sure the weapons work, or make sure that you're not being price gouged by, making them provide some financial information. So I think if their concept were reined in a bit, there would be value there, because otherwise, Lockheed Martin will be running the show forever, and that's certainly not a good outcome. But the bar on efficiency is fairly low. Unfortunately, Musk gave it a bad name with his little department, because they
Mr. Chainsaw himself, Chris. I was going to call you Chris, Bill, who set his chainsaw to government. How much of all this, Bill, is business as usual? On the one hand, of course, there's all this new technology. On the other hand, the headlines these days are about Karp, and then of Trump now authorizing covert CIA action in Venezuela. The Washington Post earlier this week imagines a Trump attack on Venezuela. We're going back to the Monroe Doctrine. Some people now call it the Donroe Doctrine. How much of this is any different from really the history of America when it comes to military involvement, particularly in Latin America?
I think maybe it's a bit more blatant. The tech folks will say, we need to beat China. They won't say China's we have to deter. They don't use kind of fine, nuanced language. They just go for it. Trump is I think more erratic, perhaps, but I think a lot of the things that have been done before. Perhaps we thought we were past that. In the early 1900s, intervention in Latin America was the norm. But maybe, certainly some of the rhetoric about human rights and, rule of law kind of was running a little thin when they were enabling mass slaughter in Gaza. So sometimes Biden's people were like the adults in the room. They were smarter. Their outcomes were not a lot better, just similar to the best and the brightest that Kennedy recruited. So there's kind of structural factors that drive the U.S. to rely on the military and to intervene and to not always follow the rules they want others to follow. So I would say there's all kinds of historical precedents, but perhaps this has speeded up a bit.
You sound a bit miserable, Bill. I mean, you're a researcher. Maybe that makes you miserable. But I mean, America is a superpower. It does have enemies. China is an enemy, for better or worse. One of the
I think
one of the subjects we've been talking about over the last few weeks is the China model. Dan Wong has a new book out on how the China model is more effective. I mean, whether or not there'll be war over Taiwan, these are real issues, aren't they?
Yeah, I think we're going about them in the wrong way. I think, for example, in Karp's book, he says America's a bunch of slackers. We need a new national mission. His mission is a Manhattan Project to militarize AI. And then he says we can get a permanent technological advantage over China, which is what they said with the atomic bomb, what they've said with many different items. So I think, yeah, we're a powerful country, but we're wasting a lot of our power on what I think are pipe dreams. Like that.
Are you suggesting that the American investment in nuclear weaponry was a mistake? I mean, it has enabled the avoidance of war or certain kinds of war, big power war, for almost a century now.
Well, yes, but I think they're going over the top now. I mean, we've got more than sufficient nuclear weapons to deter a war, and yet we're going to spend $2 trillion over the next 3 decades building more. We've got a president who goes between we don't need these things to getting up in China's grill. You got Putin threatening nuclear attacks. So I think whatever deterrent role they played is well accounted for, and a lot of this other stuff is more of a money-making proposition. And I think over-reliance on the notion that nuclear deterrence is going to save us.
You've been researching this a while. You've written books on this, on Lockheed Martin back in 2010. And as I said, you researched this in great detail. Is it the old story of companies like Lockheed Martin taking advantage of the state, milking the state?
To some degree. I mean, their moment of transition was in the 90s, the merger boom. Norman Augustine, who was at Martin Marietta, brokered those mergers. They bought 22 companies over about a 5-year period at a kind of a low point for Pentagon spending. And Augustine said, well, it's going to go up again. Let's buy cheap, and then we'll be in a dominant position. And indeed, that was the case. I mean, they get $40 to $50 billion a year in Pentagon contracts, well above any rival. So from a business proposition, Augustine, I think, was on target. But I think the question is, what's the balance of power between those corporations, the Pentagon, the Congress, the president, and does the public have any say in all this? And of course, the public would have to up their game in terms of public.
To put it mildly, I mean, how many members of our audience, or certainly the broader public, are going to have the time or the energy or the knowledge to be able to evaluate government contracts with Lockheed Martin?
Well, I think it depends at what level. I don't think they're going to read the contract, but I think if they continue to produce things like the F-35 or, pursue pipe dreams like a perfect missile defense, I think at some point people can understand those are not good uses of their money. Likewise, if you look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the promises that were made, the results that came about, I think people can understand we're heading in the wrong direction, but they're not going to audit the Pentagon or argue about this or that quality. But I think somehow they have to feel like they know enough to weigh in. And I think a lot of people just say, above my pay grade, let them handle it. And I think that's not the best approach.
How much has the US, the military-industrial complex, learned from certainly the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I don't know if they've learned enough. I mean, the whole idea back in the 90s was the revolution of military affairs. You're going to have networked warfare, precision-guided munitions, better information than your adversary. And eventually they achieved a good deal of that, but it didn't work in the wars they were fighting. They didn't really win in Iraq or Afghanistan. They were losing people to simple things like improvised explosive devices. So, you can have technological superiority. I mean, these countries barely had air defenses or air forces, but they were fighting on their own terrain. They had some local support. Our morale started to plummet on our side. So the question is, how do you approach these conflicts? And I think leaning only on technology is a losing strategy.
You mentioned Israel earlier. I know you've done a lot of research. You wrote a white paper on U.S. military aid and arms transfers to Israel between October 2023 and September 2025. How does the Israel lobby or the Israel issue and the latest Gaza war, how does this play into your narrative and your concern about the trillion-dollar war machine in Washington, D.C.?
Well, it's interesting because there's a commitment to Israel that goes well beyond the arms industry. And in fact, I don't think they needed to lobby at all about this. There was another kind of political force that was in support of arming Israel. So basically, they were able to cash the checks, get the money for doing it. But other than Palantir, which actually held a board meeting in Israel during the Gaza war and urged other companies to be more vocally supportive, for the most part, Israel was kind of a cash cow for U.S. companies, but it wasn't a policy decision that they really had to go near. It just was more of an ideological, political commitment than an economic issue. But if you look at arms trade as a whole, the U.S. under Biden sold more arms than ever all over the world, including to regimes like Saudis, the UAE, so forth. And the contractors, their role was to try to limit any kind of government vetting of these sales, just push it out the door, don't worry so much about human rights. And so in that sense, they've shaped the system under which we consider who to arm. But in the case of Israel, Gaza, it really wasn't, they weren't major players in that decision.
You mentioned the best and brightest earlier in the context of the Biden regime. Are you suggesting in your research and in your thinking on spending, particularly on this trillion-dollar war machine, that the Democrats aren't much different from the Republicans?
There are differences, but they're not different enough. I mean, there's just as much a penchant for intervention, I think, on the Democratic side, but they do believe in economic engagement, diplomacy, whereas I think Trump is a little purer into the military aspect. But sometimes the results are not dramatically different, and I don't think there's enough of a choice between the parties on foreign policy. There should be a bigger gap, and therefore different approaches, and they're not different enough.
Later this week, we have Shadi Hamid, the Washington Post columnist. He has a new book out trying to argue that America is a force for good in the world and that we should celebrate American power. I'm not sure he's necessarily in favor of American military power or investment in its military capacity. But do you share Hamid's belief that America can make the world a better place? And in that context, can that justify some military investment and indeed even in the sales of military technology to friendly regimes?
Yes. But for example, arming Ukraine makes sense. They've been invaded. They're defending themselves. Arming Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen, I would not put in that category. I think, if we had an adequate defense, but we also promoted other aspects more doggedly, our educational system, our culture. I think certainly the United States has played a positive role in many respects, not to mention we've created a country where people all over the world want to come and live and work. So I just think that the militarization kind of blunts some of those positives in a way that hurts us at a time when power is more diffuse globally than it has been in a long time.
Bill, we're talking hopefully in the wake of the government shutdown. Hopefully it's going to open later this week. Is it a zero-sum game? Can America spend simultaneously on defense as well as education and healthcare, make sure people are fed properly and housed properly? Why is it a zero-sum game?
Well, primarily because of tax cuts. I mean, the tax cuts in what they called the big, beautiful bill were even larger than the military buildup. So if you're going to not raise revenue and spend $1 trillion on the Pentagon, then you're in deep trouble in terms of funding other things. If there was a kind of a willingness to tax to pay for the military side and the domestic side, that could be done. Then the question would be, what are you doing with that military? But now, because of the fact that they're timid or about raising revenues, or they're actually slashing it, it creates more more of a trade-off than would be the case if you had, a Congress or a government that was willing to raise money for certain national purposes.
We did a show a few weeks ago with another DC-based former government official, Edward Fishman. He has a new book out, Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. It's been quite influential. I'm not sure if you've looked at the Fishman book. I'm sure you're familiar with his arguments. Do you believe that, in a way, that America is better off investing in economic warfare than military warfare? It's more effective in dealing with enemies, certainly Russia, maybe even China?
I think it's potentially, but there's got to be a game plan. A lot of the U.S. sanctions that have been put in were never removed. I think if you have sanctions, you want a goal. You want the other side to do X, and that's what the sanctions are for. But if they're broad-based, I don't think you get the same value. And of course, there's been cases where economic warfare has led to military conflict. So I think, like any other policy, it's got to be thought through. It's like economic warfare, like all against all, like Trump seems to be threatening, is not going to accomplish anything. But if you said, we want you to change in this way or this objective, something that's doable without the country actually liquidating itself, then I think it can be useful. And I think there should be double-edged. There's sanctions, but there's also positive engagement for countries that improve their behavior or do what you would like to see happening. So I think, all in all, a clearer economic policy of engagement and influence would be better than one that was leaning too heavily on the military, but it would still have to be thought through carefully, I would say.
You mentioned Elon Musk earlier. Of course, he's most famously associated now with this chainsaw, the failed Doge initiative to cut taxes. To cut government, sorry, not taxes. He's been in the news recently. Tesla have offered him a $1 trillion wage package if he can revitalize the company. Your new book also talks about a $1 trillion war machine. That word trillion now seems to be almost polemical. People use it to criticize or to make their point. Is there a right number, Bill, for the American military budget? I mean, if $1 trillion is too high, what's the right number?
Well, I would say you could cut several hundred billion, but of course you'd have to change your strategy. You wouldn't have a strategy that says we have to be able to invade or intervene anywhere in the world on short notice. Allies would have to do more in their own defense. You would have a nuclear deterrent that was sufficient but not excessive. You wouldn't build weapons that are outmoded. There's plenty of things the Pentagon would like to get rid of. Congress won't let them because it's built in their district. So we have this kind of budget that's got, aging weapons whose purpose is not clear, that Congress won't eliminate. And then you've got investments in new things. So I think certainly you could cut a few $100 billion, but there's limits. I mean, people say, oh, there's waste. Cutting waste is not going to make a big dent.
Well, let's be clear, of course, $1 trillion is $1,000 billion. So how many hundreds of billions? Could we cut it in half? Could we have a $500 billion war machine that actually protects America?
I think to get anywhere, that would work politically and in terms of our commitments, perhaps 600 billion, 700 billion, but it would have to be done. It would have to be phased in. You couldn't just change it overnight. Because, for example, if you were going to use like a different mix of weapon systems, it takes a while to develop, build, and so forth. So I think cutting it in half, you'd need a different world than we're living in now.
Right. And I'm sympathetic, obviously, to what you're trying to do. I mean, nobody's in favor of runaway military spending. But the reality in American politics, for better or worse, is no administration is going to risk being accused of not defending the country. Isn't that the problem? And an explanation of why there isn't, as you know, a great deal of difference between the Biden and Trump regimes when it comes to this issue?
Well, I think that has a political weight, but it's detached from reality. The people who say peace through strength haven't explained why in Iraq and Afghanistan we spent something like $8 trillion, didn't achieve our objectives, even though we had every manner of superior technology. So, the historical record should count. And what it's shown is putting all your eggs in the basket of force does not achieve your objectives. Therefore, we need a more balanced approach to foreign policy. But I think those ideas die hard, and I think Democrats in particular don't want to be labeled as soft on defense. But in fact, they need to be smarter on defense. You can't keep doing the same old things that haven't worked really at all in this century and say you're being tough. You're just being lazy, really.
Do we have models of presidents who have actually seriously and honestly addressed this issue? Clinton, perhaps, Nixon, FDR, JFK. I mean, Truman, of course, who bombed Japan and launched the Korea War. Are there, in your view, positive presidential administrations that we can look back to and say, well, these guys did it this way, and at least that's a beginning?
Well, Eisenhower was a mixed bag, but he did want a balance between fiscal responsibility and spending on the Pentagon. So he didn't give the industry everything it wanted. So they had a big fight.
And of course, it was Eisenhower who came up with the term military-industrial complex. Is it, sorry to jump in here, Bill, but is it possible that he was able to do it because he was a general, so people trusted him on this front?
I think partly that. Also, he had a different approach to militarism. He believed in things like, the coups in Iran and Guatemala. He had a massive retaliation nuclear doctrine, which was supposed to scare adversaries from, doing anything we didn't like. So he adapted his policy so they didn't rely on a lot of, boots on the ground invasions and so forth. But there were still risks involved in what he did. But he did battle with the industry over how many ballistic missiles, how many bombers. So it was his basically the bruises from that conflict that led him to make that speech. But he also said in the speech, an arms establishment is necessary. He just said it's getting out of hand, and we shouldn't let the people who profit from it set the agenda. That we need an alert and knowledgeable citizenry to rein it in, and of course that's a huge problem now because disinformation, misinformation, lack of engagement, people feeling like they don't have the power to influence their government. There's a big deficit on that side of the equation that has to be addressed if we were going to change the way we deal with the Pentagon, overseas intervention, these companies. So that's that's where the change would have to come if the policies were going to change.
Let's end where we began with Dr. Strangelove, the return of Dr. Strangelove. I mean, it was a funny film, of course, a great film with Peter Sellers. But it was also a terrifying film. The idea of a military general, an Air Force general who wanted to bomb his way back to the Stone Age. To what extent are there Dr. Strangeloves, Bill, in the military? People, it's one thing to have these weapons of mass destruction. It's quite another to use them. Are there people in the Pentagon who are buying these toys to use them ultimately? I mean, especially with the threat, perhaps, of a conflict over Taiwan in the South China Sea.
Well, I don't think there's a lot of caricatures of the type in Dr. Strangelove that are like chomping at the bit to use nuclear weapons, but they do have a strategy that at different levels of conflict would allow or even dictate that they be used. So I would say we're kind of victims of a strategy that needs to be rethought, because the notion is, they have this notion of the escalation ladder. Well, you use tactical nuclear weapons for this kind of situation and maybe a bit more here. And it's all presumed on that there's these two rational players saying, okay, they've only done this, so we'll only do that, as opposed to once you start dropping nuclear weapons, all bets are off. So, but I'd say
to put it mildly, they're off. I mean, and of course, Strangelove himself was developed around the actual person of Curtis LeMay. So there was a real person behind Strangelove.
I mean, the other thing I would say is some of the civilian ideologues are more hawkish than the military people. Because anybody who's actually experienced warfare is a little bit more cautious than somebody who's egging you on, never having gone through that. So I think the Iraq War, certainly a lot of the neocons were the driving force, and some of the military folks were much more skeptical. So I think it depends on the moment, but there are a few generals who've made rather outrageous statements about China who probably shouldn't be there anymore. I mean, they're speaking out of school contrary to government policy, even though they're supposed to be in the chain of command. But I would say overall the danger is just maybe miscalculation or misguided strategy. Not people who are saying, dying to go to start a nuclear war. So in that sense, it's not really Dr. Strangelove, but it's strange enough.
Strange enough, but not Dr. Strangelove. Bill Hartung, co-author of The $1 Trillion War Machine. I can't end without some reference, Bill, to AI. Does AI make your problem? Is it a solution, or are we going to deepen the problem with AI technology? Couldn't we use AI to, if not demilitarize, certainly undermine the military budget?
I think it's a tool, so it's what you use it for. I think it can crunch data. It can tell you things more quickly that it would take forever to figure out. But can automated warfare be different, better, give the U.S. an edge? I don't think so. So I think we actually need more educated folks about what AI can and can't do, especially in government. I think a lot of the tech folks would rather work at a VC firm in Silicon Valley and make real money than be at the Pentagon evaluating.
You can't blame them, can you?
They'd have to pay them better, I think, which is kind of a anathema that you would pay a government employee more because their skills are better. But I think in this case, it would be worth it.
Well, good luck. Congratulations on the book, Bill. Continue your good work. You're doing the heavy lifting. You're doing the dirty work of actually reminding everyone where this $1 trillion budget goes. And we need guys like you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, when we get it all solved, I'll come back, which may be a while.